I welcome members to the fourth meeting in 2013 of the Subordinate Legislation Committee. As always, ask members to turn off mobile phones. We have apologies from Hans Alan Malik. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. It's proposed the committee takes item 8 in private. This is for the committee to receive an update on issues recently discussed with the Scottish Government. Are members content to do so, please? Thank you. Takes us to agenda item 2, which is instruments subject to affirmative procedure. No points have been raised by our legal advisors on the Local Government Finance Scotland Order 2013 draft. Is the committee content with that instrument, please?
Yeah, content.
Thank you. Agenda item 3, instruments subject to negative procedure. No points have been raised by the legal advisors on the Scottish Roadworks Register Prescribed Fees Regulations 2013, SSI 2013-8, nor on the Less Favoured Area Support Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013, SSI 2013-9. Is the committee content with these instruments, please?
Content as being.
Thank you. Agenda item 4, instruments not subject to any parliamentary procedure. The Bovine Viral Diarrhoea Scotland Order 2013, SSI 2013-3. The drafting of this order appears to be defective. Articles 9 to 12 purport to place requirements on a keeper of a breeding bovine animal which is not part of a herd to take and submit to approved laboratories samples to test for bovine viral diarrhoea virus. However, Article 11.2 specifies sampling requirements only in relation to breeding herds. Accordingly, the regulations do not implement the policy intention that sampling requirements should also be specified for animals which are not part of herds. Does the committee agree to withdraw the instrument to the attention of the Parliament on reporting ground I, as drafting appears to be defective?
Agreed.
John.
But yes, but I would also want to declare an interest in this regard and say how very important it is that this is done, and welcome the government's intention to amend this absolutely.
Well, indeed, that was going to be my next point, because does the committee agree to note that the Scottish Government has indeed already allayed an amending instrument to remedy this? These provisions should also come into force on the 9th of February 2013, together with the provisions of this order. Thank you. Agenda item 5, the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Scotland Bill. The purpose of this item is for the committee to consider the delegated powers in the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Scotland Bill. In considering the bill, the committee is invited to agree the questions it wishes to raise with the Scottish Government on the delegated powers in the bill. It's suggested that these questions are raised in written correspondence. On the basis of the responses received, the committee would expect to consider a draft report at its meeting on the 19th of February. Section 24 provides the mechanism by which the tax bands and the percentage tax rate for each band are set. The power will set the tax bands and tax rates, and there are no limits on how these may be set beyond the limited requirements set out in Section 24 that these be progressive rates and there be at least 2 bands in addition to the nil rate band. The power has the potential to significantly affect the raising of revenue whenever exercised and not just on the first occasion. Does the committee agree to raise with the Scottish Government concerns as to whether the negative procedure is an adequate level of parliamentary scrutiny over the exercise of the power subsequent to the first exercise of that power?
Yeah.
Section 47 confers powers on the Scottish Ministers to provide for qualifying transfers of interests in residential property holdings companies to be treated as land transactions and to be chargeable transactions. Does the committee agree to ask the Scottish Government when it intends to produce a draft of these proposed regulations, why the affirmative procedure would not be a more appropriate level of scrutiny in all cases when it's clear from the Delegated Powers Memorandum that the power permits a wide range of approaches to the application of land and buildings transaction tax to residential property holdings companies, which can impact significantly on the operation of the tax regime? And does the committee also agree to ask the Scottish Government to explain the circumstances in which it would be possible to make provision for the application of land and buildings transaction tax without making textual amendments to primary legislation and therefore without engaging the affirmative procedure? Thank you. Section 55 confers a duty on Scottish Ministers to make regulations which provide for the application of this Act in relation to leases. Does the committee agree to ask the Scottish Government when it intends to produce a draft of its proposed regulations or publish proposed amendments to the bill which would replace this power, why the affirmative procedure would not be a more appropriate level of scrutiny in all cases when it's clear from the Delegated Powers Memorandum that the power concerns important issues of policy which are also of significance to consultees. Does the committee also agree to ask the Scottish Government to explain the circumstances in which it would be possible to make provision for the application of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax to leases without making textual amendments to primary legislation and therefore without engaging the affirmative procedure? Thank you. Section 67(1) is an ancillary power which is not referred to in the Delegated Powers Memorandum as it is not a freestanding power. It is a parasitic on any other power conferred by the bill and will therefore be subject to the procedure which applies to the primary power to which it attaches. It allows the exercise of the power in question to make different provision for different cases or descriptions of case or for different purposes, but more significantly allows ministers to make the full range of ancillary powers, including supplementary provision, when exercising any other power in the bill. Does the committee agree to ask the Scottish Government to justify the need for ancillary powers to be available for all powers under the bill, given the standalone provision in section 66, which could be combined with the primary power in any event?
Agreed.
Does the committee agree to ask the Scottish Government to explain why the full range of ancillary powers in section 67(1)(b) is applied also to the power to commence the bill, given that section 69(2) separately allows that power to make transitional, transitory and saving provision? And if this is intended, if this is intended, why?
Agreed.
Schedule 9 sets out the relief available in relation to chargeable transactions entered into the pursuance of the crofting community's rights to buy, the right exercisable by a crofting community under Part 3 of the Land Reform Act 2003. Does the committee agree to seek further information about the proposed use of the power in paragraph 3 of Schedule 9, the effect this may have on the land and building transaction tax regime as a whole, or on the market for transactions concerned, and whether the power might be considered by consultees to be controversial depending on how it's exercised? Section 11 sets out relief for certain transactions in connection with the reconstruction and acquisition of companies. The power in paragraph 6.3 enables ministers to prescribe the proportion of relief in a similar manner to that set out above in relation to the crofting community to rights to buy. Does the committee agree to seek further information about the proposed use of the power in paragraph 6.3 of Schedule 11, the effect this may have on the land and buildings transaction tax regime as a whole, or on the market for transactions concerned, and whether the power might be considered by consultees to be controversial depending on how it's exercised?
Agreed.
Section 16 provides that certain transfers involving public bodies which are in the process of statutory organisation are exempt from the charge. The power in paragraph 2 allows for additional types of transaction involving public bodies to be exempt from the charge. Does the committee agree to ask the Scottish Government why this power would allow additional reliefs to be set out in subordinate legislation rather than amending Schedule 16 directly so that all reliefs are retained in the Act? Does the committee also agree to ask the Scottish Government to explain why, when the power permits the specification of new transactions which are to be exempt from this power, is described as technical administrative rather than concerning the issue of principle, which is whether the transaction should be liable to tax? Do members wish to raise any further issues on the powers of this bill? We agree with all that. Thank you very much. Agenda item 6, the Public Service Pensions Bill UK Parliament legislation. Under this item, the committee is invited to consider the powers to make subordinate legislation conferred on the Scottish Ministers in the Public Services Pensions Bill. A briefing paper has been provided that sets out the relevant aspects of the bill and comments on the effect. As the bill confers functions to make subordinate legislation on the Scottish Ministers, it is clear that Standing Order Rule 9B36 requires the committee to consider those powers. Whether or not the committee wishes to report matters to the lead committee is left to its discretion. If members are content with the power, they therefore maybe consider it unnecessary to issue a formal report on this effect. Does the committee agree to find the power to be referred on the Scottish Ministers to be acceptable in principle and to be content with the level of scrutiny which is applied?
Agreed.
Well, thank you. Is the committee therefore content that no formal report to that effect is necessary?
Agreed.
Thank you. Agenda item 7, Scottish Law Commission reports. The next item on the agenda is on the evidence I gave on behalf of the committee to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on the implementation of Scottish Law Commission reports. Members have before them a note from the clerk and a copy of the official report of that meeting. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee will be considering the issue further at their meeting on the 31st of January. Therefore, any further comments members may wish to feed into the Standards Committee should be agreed upon today. Do members have any other comments, please? Am I entitled to the view that members are content with what I said?
Content.
And we'll see what the Standards Committee comes back with. Thank you. Grateful for that. We then move to agenda item 8, at which point we move into private. So, thank you very